Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Hell. I am your host, the littlest of lights, and today we're going to be going over the top stories that have happened throughout this week. If this is your first time, which it is because this is the first episode, we are going to go over the top stories that have happened throughout the week. And I record these on a Wednesday, so we go basically Tuesday to Tuesday, maybe a little bit before that if I miss something. And so I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. Did I miss a story that you wish I would have covered? What are your thoughts on the stories, etc.? So let's go ahead and jump into our stories for the week. Now, as we go through these, I just want you to keep in mind, I'm not a journalist. I'm not a guy who has all these insider scoops. I'm not a guy who goes out and talks to all these people. I'm a guy who listens to the news. I'm a guy who reads stories. And so as I go through these stories, don't sit there and expect some expertise journalism. This is just a guy rambling. And so I just need you to bear with that. Keep that in mind. So the first big story that we have this week happened just a few days. These all happened just a few days ago, I suppose, so I don't need to say that. But Aaron Bushnell, a active duty U.S. military airman, sets himself on fire in front of the Israel embassy in Washington, D.C. Now, for those of you that know, I'm in Baltimore, so that's just not too far away from me. So this guy goes to the Israel embassy and sets himself on fire in protest of the Israel-Palestine war. And before that, he was talking about online of, a lot of us like to say, what would we do if we were in Jim Crow era or in slavery or during the Nazi regime? What would we do if our country was committing genocide? And he said, what you're doing right now is just that. Now, if you know my stance on the Israel-Palestine war, you know that I'm neutral on it. I think both sides essentially just want to kill each other, and they're willing to do whatever the means are to get to that. And so standing for one side means you're standing with evil. And so I refuse to do that. I'm going to be neutral on it. And if they're going to duke it out, they're going to duke it out. But I'm not going to send our boys, I'm not going to send our tax dollars over there. I say I'm not going to, but I don't have a choice in the matter. I'm just a peasant, a wee peasant. So if I was in power, that's what I would do. I wouldn't send stuff over there because they're just both awful. In all seriousness, this is a tragedy. There was a man who believed in something so much he was willing to sacrifice it all for him. Now, looking into this guy's online presence, he and I would have not agreed on much. He was only just a couple years older than me. So he and I were in the same generation, had a lot of similar strong political convictions, but not with the same views. And so he and I would have disagreed on a lot. But that does not, I'm not going to say it doesn't matter, but I'm going to say it's really not the point. The point of the matter is that there was someone who, people chalk it up to mental illness. Some people just chalk it up to sheer passion. Man lost his life. Man lost his life in a very brutal and gruesome way. I've had the privilege of not seeing the uncensored video, and I have no intention to. But for those that have seen it, it's quite graphic. So use caution with that. If you're gonna look into it, just I don't know, that stuff messes you up, man. That stuff messes you up. Don't be looking for all that stuff. That's not good for you. But I did hear it. And as he's burning alive, he's screaming, "Free Palestine! Free Palestine! Free Palestine!" Ultimately, I don't care what position you take on. I'm not from a river to the sea guy. I'm not, because ultimately what that's going to do, that's going to kill more innocent people. But what I do think is there needs to be a ceasefire, and how Palestine needs to be able to be independent, of which it's not. If it's not independent from Israel. Israel wants to say that they're independent, but they have a port in Israel. No, they need to be able to have their own ports, their own means of production. Ultimately, it's just a bunch of shacks that have been blown up by Israel. And a lot of us in the West are just supporting them because they have a very twisted evangelical view of Israel. And that's just, it makes me sad. But it is what it is. It is what it is at this point. And speaking of it all, over this past week, Israel and Hamas were negotiating about hostages, and the U.S. vetoed a ceasefire. So, the U.S. once again just perpetuating war just to keep its power in the Middle East, even though we talk so much about, oh my gosh, it's so sad. Oh, it's so terrible. And then we step in the way of making sure. Because, ultimately, Israel's our puppet. Israel's our puppet state. If we tell them to stop, they will stop. But we're not telling them to stop because we want this carnage to keep. I say we, our overlords want this to keep happening, and it's despicable. It's disgusting. So that's probably our biggest story. I think we'll just start working down the list from here. So Roland Fryer, the youngest tenured professor at Harvard University, won a bunch of awards. He just was a really, really smart guy. I say was. He still is. He's still alive. But he started doing a lot of talks recently just about the whole situation when he came out with a study a few years back about how cops do not shoot black individuals more often than white individuals, which, I mean, that data can stand on its own merit. You know, I'm not going to argue with the data. But the question that we should all be asking is that, or why are there still all these cop shootings? I think that when you have, you know what, speaking of cop shootings, we had two really interesting stories this past week about cop shootings. I think this first story, it's a little bit more dated than a week ago, but I just had to talk about it. All right. This cop has a guy arrested in the back seat of his car, and he gets hit with an acorn, or an acorn falls down next to his car. The stories are a little conflicting. I'm not entirely too sure, but something happens. An acorn is involved, and he just turns and opens fire on his own patrol car. He dumps like his whole mag into it. His partner is there. She dumps her whole mag into his car as well. He's talking about he's hit, shots fired. There's nothing going on. Nothing happened. He just started opening fire on this dude this poor dude is just chilling in the backseat of his car. And it like, thank God he didn't get hurt. Like, thank God for that. Because if that guy died, oh man, that whole place, that whole police department, that would be such a lawsuit. Lawyers would be lining up left, right, and center. So the data may show that cops are not shooting black individuals as often as white individuals. Yeah, that's what I meant to say. Cops aren't doing that. But, I mean, we still have to take a look at the fact that so many cops are just not prepared to be in the police force. You have guys like those cops who just are shooting into a car haphazardly. We have another story that came out from some southern state. I forget where exactly. But this woman broke into her own home. She locked herself out of her house. So she breaks into her own home, which, you know, you have every right to do. I guess, you know, you break a window, it's your house, you got to pay for it. All right. Well, a neighbor sees this and she calls the cops, which is totally understandable. I mean, you see somebody breaking into a house, you know, I'm not upset about that. Well, the cops show up, and it's the middle of the frickin' night. The cops show up, they start banging on this door. Well, they go around and they don't see anything amiss. They don't see any, you know, nefarious deeds afoot. And so they go to the front door and they start banging on the door. Well, this woman who was just trying to enjoy her evening in her home, probably a little bit aggravated that she had to break her window, and then now is thinking about how she's going to pay for it, you know, calling insurance tomorrow. It's going to be frustrating. Well, now she hears this banging on her door in the middle of the night. And so she's, so she doesn't know what's going on. She lives alone. She's a woman by herself, which, I mean, like, as a guy, if I'm living by myself, I'm still answering the door with the gun. I have my gun on me at all times. And so if someone's going to come banging on my door, I'm answering it with a gun. Like, that's just what I'm going to do. I don't care if you're a cop or not. Don't be banging on my door expecting me just to be all like, here's some baked goods, sir. That's not what's going to happen. Now, she did come out with her hand on her firearm, which, you know, guys, just gun safety rule. Don't be holding your gun like this as people come to your door. Like, I get it. Maybe you want to like have like a show of force if it's a stranger at your house and you don't know who they are. I totally get that. But like, buy a Ring camera and look who it is first. And if you still don't know who it is, like, wear it on your side. You know, you don't need to be rolling up to your front door like this. This is not Rainbow Six. You can calm down. Now, even though I said it's not wise, you still have the right to do that. But the cops don't care about your rights. They just see this woman open the door with a gun in her hand, and they just go to town. They mag dumped like 3 different bags each into this woman's door. This woman, I don't know if she returned fire or not, but I know for a fact, I don't care what you're wearing. If you start mag dumping into my home without asking me any questions, you are getting returning fire. All right, that's just what's going to happen. So they start shooting, and they not only did they shoot 3 17-round mags into this woman's door, they didn't even kill her. They like, why on earth do we have these cops that are such bad shots? They're more of a threat to the community than anything else. Now, I'm thankful that they're such bad shots because that woman who was innocent didn't die. But I'm sitting here being like, what if this was a situation in which they did need to use lethal force and they just shot all around the person like a silhouette? What if they're hitting other people? We're talking so much about how gangsters in the inner city are so negligent with their shooting because, they're gangsters. And I'm sitting here thinking, like, cops are no better half the time. It seems like every other day there's a video of some shooting where a cop is just firing willy-nilly in any direction, no concern about what's behind the target, nothing. That's like the first rule of gun safety. Know what you're shooting and know what's behind what you're shooting. And that's the reason why, if you're carrying for self-defense, we always, always, always encourage you to use hollow point rounds, because we want your bullet, once it hits your target, to stop in your target, because you don't need to go through your target and hit a dog. You don't need to do that. But, ultimately it doesn't even matter if you're just shooting all around the target anyways. It's a mess, man. The police system is a mess. And I appreciate the scholarship from the Harvard professor, and the way that he was dealt with was totally, totally inappropriate and inexcusable. But I don't think it's a racial issue. I think it's just the fact that cops just have too much of a power issue and that they're too militarized. Speaking of racism, the mayor of Kansas City gets all upset with the governor of Kansas for the governor of Kansas calling those perpetrators during the Kansas City Super Bowl Chiefs. I know what I'm trying to say. The parade, the shooters that were there at the parade, he calls them thugs. He calls them thugs because the reality is they were not active shooters just trying to cause carnage. It was an altercation between 2 individuals. Now, these individuals happened to be racial. They had to be black. And that obviously is not going to get covered by the media because they're like, shoot, he's not white. We can't say that there was a mass shooting. And so when you have a situation like this, you need to call it what it is, where you have 2 thugs who are illegally carrying firearms, who are willing to pull it out on each other willy-nilly, who don't care about the people around them. They're thugs. I don't care what color you are. I don't care what race you are. I would have called freaking Oompa Loompas thugs if they was acting like that. Don't come to me and talk about like that's not appropriate language. That's racially biased language. At this point, if you're shooting around a crowd of people that you have no reason to be shooting around, I do not care. I do not care. I think you need to learn to die on different hills. Just in all honesty, I'm not a person that is against racial reform. I'm not a person that's against having a conversation about race. I'm not a person that's against all these things. All right. I'm probably much more open to that than most libertarians, and definitely more so than a lot of conservatives. But don't come to me and look at thugs that are acting like thugs and be like, you can't call them thugs because that's mean. Bro, they are shooting into a crowd of people. Somebody died. What are you talking about? Get a life. Speaking of getting lives, Alabama. So Alabama had this case ruling come out about in vitro. Now, they said that in vitro embryos have full rights as preborn babies, which means they just have total human rights, just like a full-grown elderly man. Okay. Now, I'm very, very pro-life. I'm very, very pro-life. And I'm starting to see a big shift in the Libertarian Party about that, where even a lot of our presidential candidates are pro-life, because ultimately, the government doesn't have a right to tell you what to do with your body, but when what you're doing with your body now involves another person's life, hey, maybe we should have a conversation. But in vitro, this conversation is not just as black and white, and that it makes it for a pretty difficult conversation. I'm not gonna lie. I'm not fully versed on in vitro, so I'm not going to speak too much into this. But my immediate concern is that like in vitro has so many layers of complication that if something happens to where these embryos die, like, I don't know if it would be just to hold people at fault, right? I mean, if someone dies by your hands as a surgeon or as a doctor, you're not held fully responsible many of the times unless like you're truly doing malpractice. And I think maybe we should have like a similar attitude about in vitro. I don't know if that's like the attitude that we have. Like, I'm not fully well versed on this. I'm going to admit, but when I first started hearing about this, like my immediate reaction as a Christian who is pro-life, who believes life begins at conception or fertilization, because apparently that conception is not a scientific term. I don't give a crap. But having this conversation, I feel just as dangerous and will walk on too many people for the sake of frozen embryos. And I'm like, as someone who is pro-life, I'm also like, okay, if we're going to be talking about like whose life to save more, you default save the life of the mother, or you save the life of whoever else before that child. Not because that child is less valuable, but because like we're talking about the moral quandary here, and you can disagree. That's totally fine. But if we're talking about this, it's like these people have already lived. They're already going through, people already rely on them. People already love them. This child, as tragic as it may be, doesn't have that same connection. And so when we're talking about who do we have to save and what things like that, like I'm going to go over here first. Okay, I'm just going to do that. We even do that in our society. Women and children first. Okay, that's what we do first. Okay, we have like a moral system of who gets saved first. And I think if we're talking about this, I think like IVF babies, where everything is just so tumultuous the entire way through. Like, I don't know, maybe we should have a deeper conversation rather than just saying like you drop one of them by accident and you're now legally held liable. Like, maybe. I think we should have more conversation. All right, turning on to something a little bit different. Alexei Navalny dies in Russia right after Tucker Carlson goes and visits Vladimir Putin. Now, this was just a PR disaster for Russia because immediately the Biden administration goes on, they killed him. They killed Alexei Navalny. Now, maybe they did. Maybe they did. The report that's coming out is now that he had a blood clot, which makes things a little bit more difficult for the Democrats who love to keep pushing this Ukrainian war. Like, oh, the Russians killed him. It's like, well, he might have just died. So that's just a little bit difficult. But at the same time, like, I just am wondering what all these like Russian outlets are saying. Like, I don't feel like I don't hear enough from them. Maybe they're talking and like I just don't have access to what they're saying. Maybe nobody's like translating and bringing it to the news or whatever. But like, I feel like if you were not responsible for his death and you had evidence of that, evidence of a clot, you'd be like, hey. Granted, the evidence for a clot did come from a Ukrainian source who probably learned that from a Russian source. So I mean, like, if our allies, we shouldn't even be dealing with these other guys. Let's just talk about this for a minute, right? Let's talk about this for a minute. Why on earth are we sending our tax dollars and our men and our resources thousands of miles, literally all the way around the globe, to somewhere else? I do not care. I do not care. My elementary school right across the street from me still doesn't have air conditioning. And I understand that's not federal. But I'm saying, like, we are spending billions and billions and trillions of dollars on all this foreign aid while our people are suffering. We're suffering because we're taxed out of hell. We're suffering because we have all this stuff going on and all these programs happening for all these other countries, and yet we're dying. Let Ukraine fight. There's no way Ukraine's going to win this war. There's absolutely no way Ukraine is going to win this war. There's no way Russia is going to lose this war. All right, it's just not going to happen. The only way that this will happen where Ukraine wins this war is if Ukraine joins NATO and the U.S. drops off troops in Ukraine and begins fighting the Russians. And guess what Russia's going to do at that point? Poof, that's what's going to happen. So let's not do that. And I understand Ukraine doesn't want to be under Russian rule, that part of it. Like, I totally get that. But like, that is such a historical land dispute, as Vladimir Putin wanted to say, goes all the way back to the 800s. Just filibustering. Shut up, bro. I get it. I totally get it. But that's like a whole historical thing that like we just don't have any concern about. Bring our people home. Shut down the foreign bases and stop shoveling billions and trillions of tax dollars overseas to a bunch of nonsense where the vast majority of American people don't want this war anymore. We don't want all of our money being wasted on all this foreign crap. We were done with wars for 5 minutes and we can't. The American empire just can't stop overthrowing democratically elected people and then planning their own puppets and then getting mad when people around them get mad at their puppets. Like, I'm tired of it. And I'm so tired of it. Which makes me even more frustrated because Nikki Haley is still in the running even after Trump won South Carolina, and then just last night he won Michigan or Minnesota, some upper state that starts with an M. Trump wins both of those states. He blew Nikki out in her home state of South Carolina. There are only 3 counties that voted for Nikki Haley out of instead of Donald Trump, and man, like it's just sad to see at this point, man, knowing that the only way she will get this is if Trump goes to jail, and then she's not going to be the first pick, she'll be the second pick. But guess what? If Nikki Haley becomes a Republican nominee, she 100% will become president of the United States because she's going to be backed by all these other war profiteering organizations that just have their hands in the pockets of every other member of Congress. I'm telling you, dude, if Nikki Haley becomes president, it will be one of the worst things for this country. And it's going to be one of the worst things for our pocketbooks and for the lives of millions and millions of people all around the globe. Palestinians, Israelis, Russians, and Ukrainians. Millions more are going to die because we want to make sure that we are turning over a profit for Boeing and Lockheed Martin and all these other godless organizations. I absolutely despise Nikki Haley. It's time for Nikki Haley hate time. All right, can we jump into our first segment of Nikki Haley hate time? I absolutely despise this woman. She is just scum. It's just despicable how she acts, and it's just despicable how she is a warmonger. I want nothing more than for her to not make it into that White House. I'd rather take a green. All right, I'm a libertarian, and I would rather take a green because at least the Greens are not going to spend more money on war. They're going to pull our troops out of war and all these things. That's our biggest expense is our self-defense budget. It's not even self-defense. We're offending all these people. We're going out and assaulting and aggressing all these people. We're calling it a self-defense budget? No, we are going out there and we're trying to rule the world with our American empire. And we're wondering why all these countries are getting pissed at us and why all these countries are so aggravated with us because we're causing the problem. And Nikki Haley's part of that problem. She's part of that problem where she profits off of all this war and she profits off of this and off of that. And it's disgusting and it's despicable. And I want nothing more than for her to drop out of this race and to never look at the White House again. But the reality is the longer she stays in this race, the more donations that come in. And she knows that if Trump loses, she'll become a Republican nominee and then become president. Or if Trump gets it and then whatever else happens with that in November, she will at least go back to leading her nonprofit organizations with millions of dollars more in hand for her to use. She is disgusting, and Vivek Ramaswamy was very, very accurate in calling her corrupt. It's very, very accurate in calling her Dick Cheney in heels. She's disgusting, she's awful, and should never be allowed at U.S. politics ever again. Speaking of people that shouldn't be allowed near U.S. politics ever again, Joe Biden eliminated billions of dollars more of student debt. Now, I listened to a podcast called the Church Politics Podcast by the AND Campaign. They're great people. They're not right. They're not left. They're totally I'm not going to call them third way because that's a weighted term. But they are a group of people that just do not immediately go to party lines. They think through things. Now, they think through things from a Christian perspective, and if that's not for you, hey, more or less power to you, whatever. But they were talking about how, this might be positive for some people, but it's not a fix to our situation. It's not a fix to our situation. It's not actually going to help the problem because ultimately like what it's going to do is it's going to fall on the taxpayers, and not only just on the taxpayers, it's going to fall on the lower class taxpayers, because the lower class is much less likely to go to college. And a lot of these student debts are being held up by people that went to medical school and law school, where it costs hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars to go to these schools and these programs and whatever. And so they take out all this money. They can't pay it back. They default on their loans. Biden comes and helps them out. Guess who's paying for it? People like me. People like me. I did not go to school for that. Why am I paying for your schooling? It's not fair. It's not right. It's not just. It's not. And you're holding people at gunpoint saying, give us this money to pay for their thing because they couldn't pay for it. It's not right. It's not right. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that it is. We need to stop. If you can't pay back a loan, you can't pay back a loan. Do bankruptcy, do whatever you got to do, but like, stop taking my money. Speaking of things that are taking our money, the border crisis is just absolutely just a mess. It's just a mess. And I just think it's hilarious, right? So, the press secretary, forget her name, and she was talking about how Joe Biden is gonna do something soon about the border. And so we're sitting here like, okay, this bipartisan border bill is not being passed, and it's probably true that the Republicans are using it as like a political motive to help out in November. I mean, like, that's true. That's fair. But if Joe Biden then oversteps that and then does an executive order to fix the border, rhymed. What that tells us is that he could have done it the whole time. And so this is a lose-lose situation for him, because the entire time he was saying, hey, I can't do anything, like the Congress isn't voting on it. Well, then if he could just do an executive order, we know that whole thing about Congress was a lie and that he could have just done something the whole time. Or that is true that Congress can do it and the Congress is just not working with him. So, I mean, it's a lose-lose situation for him, which is hilarious. Hilarious. I just love it. But I mean, this border crisis thing is getting out of hand. There was that Georgia killing. This illegal immigrant comes and kills this Georgian college student. And I mean, like, it's sad. It's sad. And this guy had been arrested multiple times for multiple violent crimes, was not thrown back to his country, and we're dealing with the consequences. Now, I am principally an open borders libertarian. That's what I am. That's what I believe. But with the situation we have right now with the war on drugs and the cartels and everything else, I think there are steps we have to take before we can get to that end goal. And so what we need to do now, shut down this border, find ways to roll back the war on drugs, make sure the powers of the cartel are severely cut down, and then we can start rolling out an open borders policy. But right now, trying to have this worst of both worlds thing is killing us. Also, the state of Texas sued this Catholic organization that's helping people cross the border. It is a whole thing. I don't feel like getting into it, but that happened. Speaking of people coming into the United States, Julian Assange is being extradited back to the United States, or like they're voting on his extradition. Something like that's happening. Julian Assange is a hero, and I really hope God allows for justice in the situation, because this is just getting ridiculous. Also, speaking of Texas earlier, Texas is taking on big tech because Texas is saying, hey, you aren't allowed to censor conservative voices. And I think Florida is also having like a similar battle, right? Well, I mean, like, here's my thought on it. Okay, I'm all for like yelling at YouTube and Facebook and Meta and these other companies for shutting down conservative or libertarian voices and whatever, and just focusing only on leftist voices. I think it's cool to do that, but I don't want the government involved. You kidding me? I don't want the government involved. And I think it's a clear violation of First Amendment rights. And I get like they're walking that line of like, oh, they're just talking about how they're just a service, but then they also act as a publisher, so like they don't have to follow the same regulations. But like that's the nature of them just being a different thing. Like, phone providers are phone providers, and they can't throttle you and whatever because of your beliefs and all that. Like, I get that. I mean, like, I think that's government still meddling in the market, which is bad. But I mean, like, just because like Facebook and all these other things, like, that's a totally different thing. We don't need to try and like dump more laws on it. It's just dumb. It's dumb, and I hate pretending that this is going to be helpful. And I think our last one for today, a lot of GOP retirements in the House. Thank God, get these oldies out of here. We need younger, fresher faces in there. Some are just switching. Some are like fully retiring. One guy's leaving because he said, there can't be just lifetime service. Like that's not what the founding fathers intended. And I respect that. But it's unfortunate that guys like that are the ones that actually choose to leave. And it's the guys like the warmongers who are sitting over these councils and make millions of dollars from insider trading. They're the ones that are in there for decades. So, I mean, welcome to hell. Welcome to hell. That's why we have this show. It's been a fun first episode today. If you have any thoughts about what I said or what I should have covered more or covered at all, covered better, whatever, leave your thoughts down below. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of Welcome to Hell. It has been a pleasure. I will see you next time.